Hey, it's me, Rishikesh Kannan, popularly known as HrishiKay. Subscribe to my YouTube channel and hit the bell icon now to get the latest videos and get taken into a world of entertainment, culture, sport, business, and current affairs.
I'm going to go out on a limb and say that privatization is not really taken off. You can feel free to correct me. You're the expert. But do you think the Air India deal will lay some foundation in this budget? What's the way forward as far as that is concerned?
Rishi, so it was a big deal, right? Finally, the government has sold Air India. The transfer is essentially going to happen on the 27th
True.
of Jan, change of hands. So it is a big deal. But the other track record in terms of what they have said that they would like to do, for example, the LIC, the Life Insurance Corporation divestment, and it's the largest ever, so it's a big one. And the market conditions have soured a little bit, so you can maybe blame that. But it's unlikely that will happen. It'll have to wait for FY23. So it's possible that the government adds that a potential receipt of divestment proceeds from the LIC IPO in the budget, and that's going to be a big number. There was BPCL, for example, Bharat Petroleum, which the government had spoken about. But that's been a bit of it's been a slow burner in that sense. So not very much has happened, although there have been suitors, there's been a lot of back and forth, but that is something which has not yet happened. There is Container Corporation, which is another company. So, it's been compared to what the target was in FY22, the record has been extremely patchy. But we remain hopeful that pace will pick up. If you're a skeptic, you'll say that, well, it's unlikely that 2022 you'll have market conditions as favorable as they were in 2021, right? We had an up and up kind of a market. So if you had to sell something, well, that was the time to do it.
It's my pre-budget specials. Pleased to welcome Prashant Nair, national news editor at CNBC-TV18. He heads the entire reporting team at the channel. He's been covering and reporting on India's leading companies for a decade and a half. Also regarded as one of the most astute commentators on financial markets, particularly the stock markets. Incidentally, he's covered global summits like the World Economic Forum in Davos for a number of years. Nice to meet you. I hope the family and you are safe and healthy, and you've got both your vaccines, Prashant.
Thanks so much, Rishi. Great to be here. Absolutely. Double jabbed and safe so far.
Lovely. COVID, inflation, economic growth, unemployment, infrastructure. Do you think the finance minister has to walk a tightrope and strike the right balance between populism and growth? It's not an easy one.
I think you almost gave away the headline for the next day, Rishi, because it's going to be a tightrope. It always is a tightrope, isn't it? The expenditure is limited. The ability of the government to increase expenditure is limited. Tax collections, though, have been buoyant, extremely buoyant, actually, in the year gone by. But they're nowhere close to where they were pre-COVID. They've really taken a hit. So the ability of the government to really expand, expenditure to areas which require care is going to be limited. So, it's essentially the quality of the expenditure is what will be watched very, very closely. As always, this budget comes on the backdrop of, this is the second budget post-COVID, right? The 2020 budget happened right before COVID struck. The 21 budget was the first one after COVID. And the government actually did manage to walk the tightrope. They were fiscally conservative, but they also managed to spend on infrastructure, capex, etc. And I think we hope they kind of repeat that performance this time as well.
That's wonderful. I know you get asked this a lot, Prashant, but you're going to have to allow me to do that because my listeners need to know this. Do you see the upcoming elections influencing the budget?
To some degree, it, I think, will. If you ask people in the stock markets, investors, institutional investors, they do expect that there will be a tinge of populism in the budget because of the importance of, especially the Uttar Pradesh elections. But in what shape and form, again, it goes back to the point of how much can you really do with the limited resources you have. One stunning statistic has been that almost 70% of government expenditure every year is basically tied up. There's nothing you can do out of that. That goes towards paying salaries, committed investment which has to go in every year, etc., etc. Interest payments, for example, government borrowing have to be taken care of. So there is limited room with that other 30% which is left, approximately 30% which is left. And so there is expectation that, and maybe it's the need of the hour as well to kind of take care of the lower economic strata of the population through some social security net. There's been a lot of buzz around that. And that kind of ties in with, of course, as you said, elections as well. So we'll have to see how much of that sort of finds its way into the budget.
Prashant, we've heard the phrase ease of business so many times that it's coming out of every pore. But my logical question is, how do you rate an entrepreneur's tax structure and compliance requirements in India? Can we see people experiencing ease of business?
So this has been something which the government has been sort of very focused on. So let me begin by saying that 2.5 years back, the government, for example, cut corporate tax rates, right, significantly. There was also they also cut tax rates if companies, for example, were setting up new greenfield projects, which means projects from the scratch. So do you count much lower rates of taxation as ease of doing business? I guess you do. One will have to. But I think beyond that, the government has also been sort of talking about bringing down, having a more simplified tax structure. What I mean by that is, for example, a lot of the exemptions, which are a part of direct taxes, which is both for individuals and companies, a lot of the exemptions perhaps need to go. That's why the government, for example, I think it was 2 years ago, introduced a new tax regime. I mean, they were testing the waters. So if you had the option, they gave the option, you can stick with the old regime or you can go on to the new regime. In the new regime, you essentially will not have the exemption, like for example, ATC, etc. The exemptions will go away. But of course, I mean, there has been limited takeoff there. I mean, people have not really, I think 5-6% of the taxpayer base is really taken to that. But as I said, the government was testing waters. Will we see something in this budget? It's unlikely that the government goes ahead and says, well, okay, we're moving to this new tax regime, because as I said, there's been limited offtake. But we'll have to see. There's limited scope in terms of reducing the rates of taxation. That much, I think, is pretty clear. So I mean, you never know. I mean, there'll be small amount of tinkering here and there. But I think your question was focused on entrepreneurs, people who want to start businesses, and that section. So one doesn't know. I mean, one can be hopeful, but I think it'll have to be to make the tax structure more simplified rather than just tinkering with the rates of taxation.
Lots of Chinese whispers floating around, Prashant. Do you anticipate an announcement of government-approved cryptocurrency? How should we as investors approach that?
There may be something, but I'm not very sure that there will be because, there has not been enough discussion or debate around it, right? One expected, for example, the bill to be discussed in that last parliament session,
yep.
But it was not. So we'll just have to, there is a buzz that it may come up in some shape and form, and the government may say something about it in the budget and then take it up later for discussions. I mean, basically provide guidance on what the government plans to do. So that is possible. But in terms of putting it into the finance bill in one way or the other, and then kind of passing it later when the budget comes up for approval, I think it's unlikely. The chances are low, limited.
There have been talks of state tax. Can that be a reality?
In what way, Rish?
Individual state taxes.
Look, a lot of the taxes, a lot of the indirect taxation is now under the ambit of the goods and services tax, right? Yeah. The center collects and then distributes. Earlier, states used to collect, the center used to collect, but I mean, a lot of the taxation powers were subsumed within the center. There is, of course, there are lots of areas where there still wields power to tax. But I don't think there is anything dramatic which is expected. I mean, the Goods and Services Council, for example, decides taxation on a variety of things, and that is the reason why, if you sort of speak with people who track the budget closely, economic watchers, etc., the importance of the budget, right, from a point of view of taxation has gone down because so much of the tax-related stuff, indirect taxation stuff, happens outside of the budget in all of the GST meetings, etc., which happen, and there also. I mean, there is demand that you should have a more simpler, unified. I mean, we don't need these 5-6 slabs, right? There should be a single low rate of taxation, and that will lead to buoyancy, etc. But I mean, that's it's got nothing to do with the budget anymore. That's up to the GST Council.
It actually segues very nicely into my next question. Any consensus on bringing petrol and diesel under GST? Has the GST committee reached any consensus on that? How will that impact us, Prashant?
Not really. I mean, I don't think that is something which comes up. By the way, this is also coming up. International crude oil prices, by the way, are on the boil, right? I mean, we are almost at $90 a barrel. We import 2% of the stuff. India as a country. So this has a great deal of impact. So I'm not sure that there will be anything firm in terms of bringing that under the ambit of, and of course there is a fair bit of opposition as far as states are concerned, right? Because the states get to tax petrol, diesel, etc. They charge VAT. I would say it's unlikely that something of that finds a mention in the budget. In any case, they may say something. It's possible, of course, an outside chance, and then it'll have to be deliberated upon. And then, I mean, the GST Council, as I said earlier, will have to take that up to decide what the appropriate rate, etc., is and how it will really work.
I'm going to go out on a limb and say that privatization is not really taken off. You can feel free to correct me. You're the expert. But do you think the Air India deal will lay some foundation in this budget? What's the way forward as far as that is concerned?
Rishi, so it was a big deal, right? I mean, finally the government has sold Air India. The transfer is essentially going to happen on the 27th of Jan, change of hands. So it is a big deal. But the other track record in terms of what they have said that they would like to do, for example, the LIC, the Life Insurance Corporation divestment, and it's the largest ever, so it's a big one. And the market conditions have soured a little bit, so you can maybe blame that. But it's unlikely that will happen. It'll have to wait for FY23. So it's possible that the government adds that a potential receipt of divestment proceeds from the LIC IPO in the budget, and that's going to be a big number. There was BPCL, for example, Bharat Petroleum, which the government had spoken about. But that's been a bit of it's been a slow burner in that sense. So not very much has happened, although there have been suitors, there's been a lot of back and forth. But that is something which has not yet happened. There is Container Corporation, which is another company. So, I mean, it's been compared to what the target was in FY22. The record has been extremely patchy. But we remain hopeful that pace will pick up. If you're a skeptic, you'll say that, well, it's unlikely that 2022 you'll have market conditions as favorable as they were in 2021, right? We had an up and up kind of a market. So if you had to sell something, well, that was the time to do it. But the government has, of course, said many times that it is committed to selling what they call non-strategic assets. So I think they will reiterate that a lot of the work is still going on. For example, in the case of LIC, and it has been going on. So we'll just have to wait and see. I think it'll be a big number, including what they expect from the LIC IPO.
A good amount is allocated towards the Rural Employment Generation Scheme. If I'm not mistaken, it's called the NREGS. Do you think, Prashant, it's benefiting the economy overall?
It's quite interesting. It's been a big buffer, right? I mean, in a country without social security, I think it has really helped. And by the way, the offtake from that scheme, right? I mean, it's basically demand for work. So demand for work shot up during, I mean, if you remember the depths of the COVID second wave, of course, when the lockdown, etc., happened, the government had to increase allocation for Manrega, this particular scheme. So it has acted as a social security net for the lowest strata of the population. And I think, as you said earlier, this is also something which is the budget which is coming up right before important state elections. And I think that is one route which the government may actually use to kind of provide for through that particular scheme. So it's possible that allocation for that actually goes up. And yes, to your question, it actually has helped, especially in the last 2.5 years or so.
Textile and construction are two labor-centric industries. Can we expect anything on these fronts or other such industries in the budget?
Infrastructure is going to be a big sort of talking point. So as I said, 2021, the budget was the first after COVID. Revenues were tight. Although, I mean, in hindsight, we know now that FY22 tax buoyancy has been extremely strong. Tax collections have been extremely strong. But when the government presented the budget in 2021, they did not know that will be the case. But even in that year, in 2021 budget, the government managed to increase what they promised, that is the budgetary estimates on infrastructure. When I say infrastructure, it means rail, railways, port, everything, aviation, etc., everything. So they increased the allocation towards infrastructure by quite a bit, which came as a very positive surprise. And the government was lauded for that. Well, the markets, of course, like more. The quality of expenditure is what matters, right? I mean, what are you exactly spending on? And this is something which investors, etc., were pretty excited about. And I think the expectation is, if in that year, with uncertainty about tax revenues, etc., the government was able to allocate that, there will be a substantial increase this time around as well. I think the overall sort of number there is about 5.5 odd lakh crores last year. I think it's expected to go up to about 7 lakh crores all. I mean, the total expenditure in budget FY23.
I asked this question to Sneha Shenoy, and I want to run you through this. It's a more of a look back or a look see, and I'd like you to react to this. If you can remember iconic budget announcements from the past, budget announcements that you thought or you felt created huge milestones, need not just be 1, 2, or 3 of them. Anything that comes on the top of your mind, please tell us.
I mean, I was, of course, not tracking budgets as I was, but I mean, of course, the big one was the 91 budget, right, which opened
liberalization.
Up the liberalization. There was a 99 budget, which was called the golden budget, which was presented. Again, it gave a huge boost to the economy. There was, I think, the one presented under UP, I think it was 2008, 2009, I think, right after the financial crisis, right? Again, an extremely tricky time. That was the last proper crisis we had. Of course, I mean, you can call the COVID crisis, but it was short-lived. 2008, the global financial crisis was a big one. And the government had to kind of stimulate the economy. So they announced a big stimulus program right out of that crisis. Of course, I mean, the complaint later became that the stimulus stayed for far too long, and that created inflationary conditions. But I think that's another one. And of course, I mean, under NDA 1, there's been the budget where the GST announcement, etc., was made. So that's been a big one. Actually, over the last the 2 terms of the NDA this time around, so much has been done outside of the budget, right, in terms of announcements, etc. So the budget itself, because as I said, GST took away indirect taxation, right? I mean, otherwise we used to see so much tinkering, customs duty, this duty, that duty. But I think now with the GST on, a lot of the taxation has been taken out of the ambit of the budget. So I think it's really become a statement of accounts over the last many years, and I think people welcome that. That why should the budget be this 1 day in the year when there is so much built up, right? And the room for disappointment, room for surprise becomes humongously large. And I don't know if that's exactly something which is healthy. So it's a reforms announcements. It's been an ongoing process. Not to take away from the budget, but I think that's been the way it has been, at least under NDA 1 this time and in the second term so far.
Okay, now we're going to get away from the specifics, and for people who've tuned in late or have come in late, do a full overview. Prashant, why should our listeners pay attention to the budget?
And at the end of the day, you get a good sense, right, of how your tax money is being spent. I mean, towards what, right? Is it being spent towards building infrastructure? Is it being? I mean, it's as simple as that. I mean, is it going into building bridges, roads, metros, rail, etc.? Is it going to kind of subsidize the poor, right? What is the direction that it's also a time when the government sort of talks about what it wants to do, not just in the coming year, but it kind of puts out, like, for example, the new tax regime which was put out. The government did not implement it, but it said that this is what we want to do. We want to test the water. So it's also, in a way, directional. So, I mean, if you're a taxpayer and if you're a concerned citizen, I think it's a pretty important day in terms of just listening from the government in a comprehensive way. What really is the focus of the government going to be? If you're an investor, I mean, I think it becomes doubly important because there is still enough the government can do to kind of revive animal spirits, to give push to various sectors, etc. in the economy. Infrastructure, for example, is one where there is expectations. Otherwise, I mean, I would say this is a budget where expectations are kind of running low, but I think infra is still one area where the expectations are there. So I think, I mean, investor, not investor, as long as you're a taxpayer, or even with, not being, if you don't fall in the slab, I think it's a document which is important. It's should be well tracked, and we hear from the government what their intent is going forward.
In a sense, you've answered this, but just to emphasize, where or which sector is the government likely to focus on this time? What is the expectation?
I would say 2 or 3 things, right? Boosting consumption is one, because it's becoming increasingly clear. I mean, we talk to companies, for example, Bajaj Auto, 50% of the sales is from the domestic economy. A lot of their sales are, come from the lower sections of the economic strata. They're saying, well, that part of the market is hurting, right? HUL, that's as large company in terms of FMCG sales. Again, they're saying, well, rural is hurting. And so many other companies we speak with, I'm just mentioning 2. And even without commentary from companies, I think it's pretty clear that maybe, some help is required in terms of boosting consumption. Maybe leave more hands in the money, not necessarily sort of announce fresh schemes to transfer more money, but perhaps maybe collect less from that section, something. So that is one, boosting consumption broadly. I mean, there are various ways to do it. And second, of course, is I think the government's continued trust on infrastructure. Having said all of this, I think what is also important is that even during the depths of the COVID crisis, right, the government has not really. It's been polar opposite of what has happened in the West, where there's been a huge amount of stimulus. The US, for example, has been giving out checks, but they've got the opposite problem. We've got so the government has been pretty fiscally conservative. If you remember, we got the 20 lakh crore package, which was announced sometime in June or July of 2020. But it was not as if the government was spending all that money. It was basically a lot of loan guarantees, right? Which the government said and that all of that totals up to 20 lakh crores. And that did help. So the government has been fiscally conservative, and I think they will be fiscally conservative, especially at a time when interest rates around the world are starting to move higher. And that's why the markets, for example, if you've been watching, got roiled a little bit all over the world. So this is not a time to be fiscally irresponsible. They've not been that way in the past. I don't think that's something which we should expect them to be in this particular budget as well. So as you began by saying, it's a tightrope, Rishi.
Any expectations with respect to relief on tax rates for the common man, Prashant?
The standard deduction, for example, 50,000 rupees, that may go up a little bit. Can they do something more in terms of interest on housing loan, which stands at about 2 lakh crores exemption, 2 lakhs per year? Can that be increased a little bit to kind of sort of give a durable boost to the housing sector, which is, again, a pretty important sector. You mentioned construction earlier, right? It generates a lot of employment, etc. And housing sales, etc. have picked up quite a bit over the last 6 months, 7 months. I could go. Every budget, there's a long list of what we can expect, right? But realistically, I would just say, well, there are these 2.
Prashant Nair, National News Editor at CNBC-TV18. I really appreciate your time. Thanks very much for your pre-budget thoughts, and stay safe and healthy.
Rishi, thank you so much for having me. Thank you.